Last week I mentioned to you that over the few weeks leading up to Christmas I wanted to do a short series of addresses entitled The Promise of His Coming. And you remember last week I began by using that illustration drawn from my predilection for whodunits, in which I said if you read the last chapter of a whodunit, you would know whodunit, but you wouldn't necessarily know why or in what circumstances they did what they did. And I said that the Bible is a bit like that. If you read the New Testament, it tells you of what God has done for us in the Lord Jesus Christ. But if we only read the New Testament, which is only 21% of the Bible, and we don't read the rest of the Bible, which God has inspired and given to us, then we won't really understand fully why Jesus came and what he came to do and what he achieved. So last week we noticed that right the way back at the beginning of the Bible story, when Adam and Eve had fouled up the world that God had made, and sin had entered into the world, and all the corruption that we know as a result of sin, God made a promise. He made a promise that one day one who was a descendant of the woman would come and would put the whole sorry mess back to rights. That was the promise we reflected on way back in Genesis chapter 3 verse 15. Ironically, it was a promise that came in the context of God speaking to the serpent. But it was a promise nonetheless that God would one day resolve the problems in his world that had been brought upon it through the sin of Adam and Eve. Well, time passed by, as we sometimes say. And every so often in the Old Testament story, champions arose who it might be thought were those whom God had appointed as the fulfillment of that promise way back in Genesis. Some of them are on the wall here in our chapel. Moses, King David, Daniel, Nehemiah. People came and it appeared that at first they might be the one that God had promised. But sadly, those champions very rarely proved anything other than ultimately major failures. Moses might have been the one who God spoke to in a special way and revealed the Old Testament as we know it to his people. But he was a murderer. David was perhaps the greatest king who ever lived. But he was a murderer and an adulterer. His son Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived, but he proved to be a wise fool. And so as we go through the Old Testament story, we are still waiting for the one who God has promised. Indeed, as we go further through the story, things get often worse and worse. The people of God find themselves in darker and darker circumstances. But God had not forgotten his promise. When God speaks, what he says is true. When he makes promises, they are promises that, unlike many of our promises, they are promises that are kept. So God kept his promise. He hadn't forgotten. Indeed, he sometimes added new promises that seemed even more ridiculous than the promises he'd made before. One promise after another promise after another promise. Now, Isaiah was probably the greatest preacher and prophet in the Old Testament. And one of the themes to which he frequently returned was the fact that the coming one would be a servant. He spoke of God's servant. If you go through the book of Isaiah, you'll find, I've given you the references on the sheet, you'll find a number of occasions that Isaiah returns to this subject of the servant. It's one of the characteristic themes of his ministry. They say of some preachers, 10,000 are their texts and all their sermons one. Well, that may or may not be true of some of us. But for Isaiah, well, not 10,000, but certainly 4 or 5 sermons that he preached in the context of his ministry, he returned to this subject of the servant who was to come. When this one who was promised, when this messianic figure who had been promised way back in the time of Genesis, the time of Adam and Eve, when that person came, he would come as a servant. When we come to that passage that we just read together, he says something else about the servant. He speaks again of the servant in Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12. But he speaks of him as a suffering servant. When this one came, who God had promised, he would come as a suffering servant. Look at what is said about him here. His suffering is graphically described. First of all, we're told he would lack those characteristics that prompt human interest and following. You know, when I open my newspapers or go on the television, who are the stories about? They're about people with power, prestige, or if I may use the phrase, an X factor about them. Something special, some quality that sets them apart. That is how we judge people, and those are the people who are constantly in our news. Whether it's the local press or the national press or the international press. But when the Messiah appeared, he would appear not as carrying any of those things that we associate with greatness. Indeed, he would be characterized by those things that normally cause us to step slightly aside from people. Those we are inclined to marginalize. He is revealed here as something of a misfit. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, familiar with suffering, like one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Indeed, the passage goes on to speak of, in terms of suggesting a certain repulsiveness to this one. We considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. Here then was one who was to come as a servant of all, as a suffering servant, not marked out by those things that we regard as important, indeed characterized more by those things that cause us to marginalize and turn aside from people in our own world. His whole life would be a suffering life. You know, we cope with suffering up to a point, but when people are in permanent suffering, then somehow very often we sort of step back from that suffering. We're prepared to help people who are temporarily ill, but to identify with those who are terminally ill is something we sometimes find very difficult indeed. We run out of answers, and we're embarrassed. Well, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. He would suffer a cruel death. That's referred to in verses 5 and 7. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him. By his wounds we are healed. He was oppressed, afflicted, led like a lamb to slaughter, like a sheep before shearers. The picture is one who, at best, was a marginalized member of society. One who was enveloped in suffering. One who experienced a cruel death. A death that would itself be unjust. And his end was the end of a common criminal. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. His death would be unjust, and he would be disposed of like a common criminal as far as the world was concerned. Thrown into a common grave, we might say, in modern language. Now, of course, Isaiah knew that that wasn't exactly how it would be. That might be what people preferred, but in fact, he was buried with the rich in his death, because Joseph of Arimathea, we know, provided him with a grave. Interestingly, the passage also tells us that people would judge that this life was one that was lived out under the judgment of God. Surely he took our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. And then in verse 10, there is the confirmation, isn't there? Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. Actually, the judgment that is made that this is a life under judgment is true. So we have this picture of the coming one who would come as a sufferer, one who would be marginalized by society, one who would be subject to injustice, death, and disposed of as though he was so much offal and rubbish. Yet what Isaiah tells us is that appearances can lie. We know that, but we need to be reminded of it in connection with the one that God promised. The suffering servant would prove to be the promised seed. Now, if that's the case, it begs the question, how does this suffering crush the serpent's head? If this is the promised seed, how is it that in the life that is described here, the seed is the promised seed, the serpent's head is broken? Well, Isaiah seems to give us an answer here. He first of all describes the suffering servant's ministry as one who is vicarious. Now, I'm not an Anglican, and I'm bewildered sometimes by the various terminology that Anglicans use of their vicars or their priests or their archdeacons or their rural deans or their chancellors, whatever it is. But the word vicar originally means someone who represents others. That's what the word means. So a vicar is someone who acts on behalf of the community in undertaking the service of God. That's where that term comes from. But here, verse 4 emphasizes that he was this suffering servant, Jesus we know him to be, was acting on our behalf. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Jesus, we might say, is the greatest ever vicar. He took upon himself our infirmities and carried our sorrows. He was taking upon his shoulders those things that have characterized humanity since the Garden of Eden. He took the burden of those things upon himself and bore them on our behalf. How did he do that? Well, if you look at verse 5, it helps us understand it. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. He acted on our behalf, but he acted on our behalf in such a way as to act as our substitute. He didn't simply act for us, he acted in our place, is what Isaiah is saying here. In particular, we're told he bore the punishment of our failure to meet God's standards. That's what the word transgression means. God's character has been revealed in his demands upon people from the beginning of the world. We've failed. And what Isaiah says is, he recognizes that failure, but he sees this one as coming to meet and bear the substitutionary penalty for our transgressions. He bore our transgressions and the iniquity Iniquity is a word that means the deep-seated side of sin, the disease that lies at the heart of all sinful activity. He dealt with both our failure to live up to God's standards, and he dealt with the inherent corruption that lies within. He would be our representative, he would be our substitute, and he would be one who bore our penalty. 53 verse 5 again, the punishment that brought us peace was upon him, by his wounds we are healed. He acts for us, he acts as our substitute, and he bears the penalty of our own, the judgment that stands against us. And his resurrection would be the means by which his action would be rubber stamped. After the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of and be satisfied by his knowledge. My righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Back in Genesis chapter 3 that we looked at last week, we were told that the time would come when there would be a combat between the devil and this representative, this promised Messiah. That the one would bring great damage to the other. The devil would break the seed's heel, but the promised seed would destroy the head of the serpent. And so we see precisely that reflected here. He would suffer much, but he would suffer much to the end that he would actually conquer and break the power of Satan once and for all. The result of that would be his fame would be great. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils of the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. His fame will be great, and his victory universal. In fact, if you look back at the beginning of the end of chapter 52 that we began our reading, it seems to be that what is described there is that those who had despised him, those who themselves had authority and greatness and kingdom and so on and so forth, they would themselves be gobsmacked in the face of this one who was raised to a dignity and authority far greater than they could ever aspire to or ever know. The nations would marvel at him, and it would be overwhelmed with the good news of the message that he would bring. And yet, as we close, I want to draw your attention to the fact there is a paradox here, and there's both a challenge that comes with the paradox. This is the message that Isaiah brings. It's a message of good news indeed to a fallen and sad and tragic world. But he says, who has believed our message? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He didn't expect people to actually grasp the greatness of this message because of the way in which God would act in such a mysterious way through a sufferer and a servant. It did appear almost unbelievable. It still appears unbelievable. It's part of the reason why the world despises the Lord Jesus Christ, for his kingdom is not yet revealed in all its glory. Yet he is the one, he is the promised seed who would come and in his suffering and death would bring to an end the corruption and sin and disease that has characterized our fallen world. Let's pray together. We thank you, our Father God, that when, as a human race, when as individual members of that race, we were in darkness and under judgment, you entered into our world in the person of your Son as the promised seed. And though in a manner mysterious and beyond our comprehension. You, through Jesus, reconciled us to yourself through his offering of himself as our representative and substitute, and to bear the penalty of our sin. As we reflect upon these things, warm our hearts, nourish our faith, strengthen our love for the Lord Jesus, and help us to serve him better. And in these days, as we reflect especially upon his coming, may our hearts be enlarged